Let's make some croissants. To make our croissant dough by hand, we're going to start by adding flour to a mixing bowl. Then we add in the butter. Next, we're going to do something similar to when we make pastry, which is we're going to rub the butter into the flour. So what this means is we break the butter into little pieces and then smush it into the flour with our hands so that they mix together. The reason for this is that the butter is the most difficult ingredient to incorporate into the dough, and it's easiest just to mix it into the flour at the start. So mix until the butter has been broken down into really small pieces. You want it to be like smaller than the size of a pea. Now we're going to add the rest of our ingredients. So the dry ones first, the sugar, salt, instant yeast, then the wet ingredients, milk, and water. Now we're going to mix everything until we form one homogeneous ball of dough. To start with, I like using a knife for mixing. If we mix with our hands, then our hands will get very sticky. So it's best to mix with a tool to start with. And then once it started forming into a ball of dough, use your hands to mix. Just knead and squeeze and punch and press and any other verb to the dough to make it mix together nicely. And use the dough to scrape the sides of the bowl to make sure that you're incorporating all of the ingredients. What we're looking for is the dough to be homogeneous. This is another way of saying the dough is fully mixed, or that there's no dry patches in the dough. So all parts of the dough look the same. Once it's fully mixed, form the dough into a ball. Then take a rather large piece of cling film and wrap the dough in it. It's useful to use a large piece of cling film here because we will be reusing it later when we're laminating. And off the dough goes into the fridge for 24 hours. However, we will be doing a 4-edge fold at the 12th hour or somewhere around the 12th hour. So it doesn't have to be exactly 12 hours later. It can be like 10 to 14, but somewhere like midway in the cold fermentation, we need to do a 4-edge fold. So just take the dough and press it out, thin it out a bit into a sort of rectangle shape. So take one of the edges and fold it over onto the opposite edge, and then press down to seal the dough together. Thin the dough slightly with a rolling pin, and then turn 90 degrees. So what we're gonna do is do the same fold, but then for a different edge, and rotate 90 degrees again. And then repeat. So roll out the dough, take the next edge and fold it down, rotate 90 degrees, and roll again. And do the same thing for the final edge, so fold it down. So this is called a 4-edge fold. The reason is you're folding each of the 4 edges over. The reason for doing this is that it helps mix the ingredients and make sure they're evenly dispersed in the dough. Practically what it means is that we will develop more gluten than if we just left the dough for 24 hours. So once that's done, just rewrap the dough and then put it back in the fridge and then leave it for the rest of the 24-hour cold fermentation. It's time to create the butter block. The butter block is going to measure 15 centimeters wide by 20 centimeters tall. So we need a piece of baking paper or greaseproof paper that is just over double those dimensions. So it's got to be about 43 by 33 centimeters. The next step isn't strictly necessary, but I like to do it because it makes things easier. So I like to mark out on the back of the piece of paper the rectangle, which will be used to size the butter block. So we're going 15 wide and 20 tall. Make sure you flip the sheets of paper over so that your butter won't come into contact with the pen ink or the pencil graphite. So here's the butter. This is quite hard. It's easiest to shape a butter block if your butter is soft, but I'm going to show you how you can do it when the butter's hard as well. So just place the butter in the center. Fold up the long edges first. To make it easier, you can put your ruler onto the edge and then fold over the ruler, because that will give you a nice straight line. and then just pull the ruler out. So if that's one edge done, the other long edge. At this point, grab your rolling pin and we're going to start bashing the butter. Bashing it will make it softer and easier to shape. When it feels like it's softened, you can start trying to roll it towards the sides. So roughly roll it into the long edges and then just readjust to make sure that these edges are straight, the long edges are straight. If the butter has gone slightly over, then we can always just trim that off and put it back in the center. And it's always best to use something that isn't sharp to cut the butter. So I'm using a plastic dough scraper. The reason for this is we don't want to cut the parchment paper itself. So our two long edges look nice. Now it's time to fold over the short edges. So I'll show you from side on what I'm doing. I'm laying the ruler down so the edge is on the line that we marked out, then pulling this over, and then pulling the ruler out and just pressing down to create that fold. From here, we're just going to roll the butter to get it to go into the empty spaces. Pay attention to try to get butter into the corners because they're the most likely spots where you'll be missing butter. So I like to roll into the corners first. And then go into the short edges. So we have butter in all areas of the rectangle, but we just need to make sure that it's an even thickness throughout, because at the moment I can feel that, for example, this part here is thicker than this part here. So we just need to manipulate the butter to get it nice and even. One trick you can also try is to get something flat, put it over the butter block, and then spread your hands over it and press down. That can help to make the butter a more even thickness as well. So there it is. There is our lovely butter block, and this is going to go into the fridge. Once the 24 hours are up, take the dough out of the fridge and put it onto your work surface. You're going to need to flour the work surface so that the dough can move around. At this point, we need to shape the dough so that it is double the width of the butter block and the same height as the butter block. So it needs to measure 30 centimeters wide by 20 centimeters tall. Once we've got those dimensions, we need to make sure that the dough block is nice and cold. So we're going to put it into the freezer for about 15 minutes. For locking in the butter, our dough needs to be between 2 and 5 degrees Celsius. When you put the dough in the freezer, it's a good idea to take the butter out of the fridge. So lay your dough block in the center of your work surface, and then put the butter block in the center. Now the dough might have shrunk a little, so you can always just re-roll it to make it a little larger. Like, there's always going to be a lot of little adjustments made in this process. From here, cut the 2 flaps of dough off from each side of the butter block, and then flip them over and place them on top. We need these 2 pieces to cover the entire top surface. Just stretch them to make any adjustments so that each flap covers half of the surface. Once they do, then just crimp down the center line to join the 2 pieces together. And that's our lock-in complete. So this is a 3 lock-in because there are 3 layers. You can also do a 5 lock-in. However, the 3 lock-in is way more common. It's the standard used in professional kitchens. Now it's time to roll the dough out and do our first turn. So just flour the work surface, flour the top of the dough, and start by using a rolling pin to press down the dough. The reason for doing this is it helps to lock the dough and the butter together, and it's actually gentler than doing normal rolling. Just pressing down like this means it's less likely that the butter will fracture. So butter fractures when it's cold and when there's a lot of tensile force applied to it. Pressing down using a rolling pin just applies compressive forces, so it's nice and gentle. At this point, it's useful to use rolling guides. So I'm just using some wooden sticks that have specific thicknesses. The reason for using these is it ensures that your rolling is nice and uniform. So the dough remains the same thickness throughout the whole of the dough. To start with, I like to roll using 8mm thick guides, and then 6mm, and then 4mm. The ones I'm using are made of wood, but you can use acrylic ones as well, and they're probably better. We're going to be doing a double turn, so we want the length of the dough to be about 4 times the width of the dough. Here the width is 15 centimeters, so we want the dough to become 60 centimeters long, or just over that. It's helpful to go slightly over because we're going to trim the ends. The dough is the right size now, so I'm just going to turn it sideways so you can see the double turn. To start with, brush off any excess flour. The reason for doing this is excess flour will stop the layers from sticking to each other. Next, we're going to trim the ends of the dough. This is just to get rid of any excess dough. So you trim until you can see butter in the dough layers. So for example, in this piece of trim here, we can see a layer of butter sandwiched between 2 layers of dough. So that means that we've trimmed enough and we don't need to trim anymore. Next, dampen the surface of the dough with water. I use a spray bottle because it's really convenient, but you can brush it on. Then fold one of the edges over a short distance. And pull the second edge to meet. So they should sit flush against each other. Press down to seal the 2 dough layers together. And then brush off any excess flour from the top surface. I also like to lightly press down with the rolling pin just to make sure the 2 surfaces are sealed together properly. Now moisten the top surface with water again. And fold the dough in half. To finish the double turn, we're going to release any elastic tension in the dough. So we just take a knife and I'm going to cut along this edge here. And then the 2 smaller edges. So we just cut where the dough has been folded because this is where the dough has been stretched the most. And by cutting, we release the tension held there. Now we're going to chill the dough in the freezer. But before we do that, we're going to roll the dough until the length is double the width. The reason we thin the dough is so that it will cool more evenly. So put the dough into the freezer for 20 minutes, making sure it's wrapped in something like cling film. For our single turn, we want the dough length to be just over 3 times the width. As you can see, when I'm starting to roll out the dough, I'm not actually rolling, I'm just pressing down using the rolling pin. So this lengthens out the dough nicely. I prefer pressing down like this rather than rolling with the rolling pin because it's just gentler on the dough. And then when I do start rolling, I use guides because they make sure that I'm rolling evenly. So the length of this dough is now triple the width, which means we're ready for trimming and doing our single fold. So we trim in exactly the same way as with the previous fold, where we cut until we can see butter sandwiched between the dough layers. Again, we brush the surface to get rid of any excess flour and moisten the surface with the water. So this folding scheme is different to the double fold. This is called single fold. The way it works is we're going to fold one edge 1/3 over and then the other edge 1/3 over. Just check the fit to start with, don't seal anything down. Then once you have your fit, push down the first flap of dough to seal it and brush off any excess flour from the top. Spray some water on to dampen this top surface and then fold the second flap over and press down to seal. And that is our single turn. We're going to release some tension in the dough, so just cut into the folded edges. So there's one on that side. And then if we turn the dough around, there's another one on this side. We need to cool down our dough again. So again, we're just gonna roll it out to make it a little bit thinner before it goes in the freezer. This time, the length will be about 1.5 times the width. It's difficult to go further because the dough will be quite elastic at this point. From here, wrap the dough up again. You have a couple of options here. You can either do the same thing where you freeze it for 20 minutes, or you can leave it in the fridge for about 1 hour to 1.5 hours. The advantage of just putting it in the fridge is that it will give the dough a longer time to relax, so it will be easier to roll out for shaping. We're going to roll out the length first. So these croissants have a height of 35 centimeters. So we need to roll the dough out until it's 35 centimeters long. That 35 centimeters is a choice. Like, you can have different heights for croissants depending on how you want them to look. The look of a croissant is defined by its height and the base width of the triangle. So the larger the ratio of height to base width, the taller and kind of chubbier looking your croissants will be. The lower the ratio, the more wide and thin your croissants will be. So once we've got the length, we can start rolling for the width. As a rule of thumb, when you're rolling out pastries, they should be around 4 millimeters thick. So what I'm doing here is I'm rolling out using a 4 mil thick guide, and I'm not really worrying about the dimension. However, if you don't have guides, then for this recipe, you want to roll out to about 24 centimeters wide. And if the pastry is elastic and resisting you and springing back, then you can always wrap it up and put it back either in the freezer for about 10-15 minutes, or you can put it in the fridge for like 15 to 30 minutes. This helps give it a little bit of time to relax, and it makes rolling easier. Actually, it is useful to go over the dimensions slightly because we are going to trim this sheet. So going 1 centimeter over. So just trim around each edge, very small amount, just to square up the dough. This is purely just to make the dough a bit neater. And it makes it easier to mark out the triangles for cutting our croissants. At this point, we have our rectangle. It's nice and rectangular. However, the dimensions might be slightly off just because the dough is elastic. It might have changed shape and shrank slightly. For our croissants, we want the triangles to be 35 centimeters high with an 8 centimeter base. However, it doesn't matter if you're slightly off with this. So for example, if you have 8 centimeter bases and 32 centimeter tall croissants, like, they're still gonna come out good. My dough is a little undersized, but if you have the full dough, then you want to mark at 8 and 16 centimeters along the base. And then on the top edge, mark at 4 centimeters. Move your ruler or your tape measure and then mark every 8 centimeters. All we need to do now is cut between the points that we marked. It's easiest if you use a straight edge as a guide for your knife, and you'll get cleaner cuts that way. So we end up with 5 normal sized croissants and then 2 smaller croissants. If you don't want to proof and cook your croissants now, then this is a good stage to freeze them at. So just wrap them up in cling film and put them in the freezer, but make sure they're not touching each other. If you look at the cut section of the dough, you should be able to see lines, and that will show that you have a good lamination. You'll be able to see the lines of butter. For shaping, to start with, just brush off any excess flour from both sides. If you don't brush off excess flour, then you can get large layer separations in the final croissant. Then dampen the surface with water. I'll show you a few different options for rolling, but in this first one, it's pretty simple. You just roll straight up. Now you don't want to press hard here, and you don't want to generate any tension in the dough. It's just really light rolling up. Once you reach the end, then you just want to tack the point down, and the croissant will sit on that point. Another option is to stretch the croissant before you roll it up. So you grip the base gently with one hand, and then using the other hand, you again gently pull on the dough to stretch out the triangle. This extra length just means that you'll get more shoulders in the final croissant. So the same as before, you just roll straight up and tuck the tip under so that the croissant can sit on it. So if we compare those croissants, you can see the one on the right, which we just rolled, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 shoulders, whereas the first one only has 3. So the final option is more like what they would do in professional bakeries. So they'd start off by stretching the croissant like we did before. It can be easier to stretch towards you in this direction. Then take a knife and make about a 2 centimeter cut into the base. From there, you just pull the base slightly apart to split that cut. Roll over the inside edges of the cut, like so. And then roll the croissant up over that. Nice and lightly, nice and gently. Then just tack down the tip again. But as you can see, you end up with a croissant with bigger ears. So it is slightly wider than the previous one. It's time to proof them. So just put the croissants onto a tray lined with baking paper. Make sure they're nicely spaced apart because they will double in size and we don't want them to proof into each other. At this point, you should be able to see the laminations. So it's a bit difficult to show, but hopefully you can see the really thin layers of butter within the dough spiraling around. Leave them to proof at 25 to 28 degrees Celsius for about 2.5 to 3 hours. It's also important that where you proof them is humid, as we don't want them to dry out. So technically you need above about 85% relative humidity. There is a video testing proofing locations which will help you if you want to understand if you have a good proofing location. So here's what they look like when they're proofed. So there's a few signs that they've proofed properly. One is that they've doubled in size. Another is that they're jiggly, so that if you literally vibrate the tray, they will start jiggling. And a final sign is that there is layer separation in the center, so where the ears of the croissant are. So it's time to egg wash. So using a brush, we're going to paint the egg wash onto the croissant. Do this nice and gently because we don't want the brush to poke into the croissant. The croissants have a quite delicate structure at the moment, so yeah, poking with a brush wouldn't be good for them. And just paint over the entire surface of each one. The purpose of the egg wash is just for color, so it gives a nice brown color to the croissants. And there are many different variations of egg wash. There's some that include cream, some recipes are just egg, some just egg yolk, some include salt, and sometimes you'll see recipes which say just a brush with milk. These are ready for the oven now, so put them into an oven that's been preheated to 180 degrees Celsius for 17 minutes. And here are the beauties. They should have a lovely golden brown color. Unfortunately, you can't eat them yet. You need to leave them to cool on a cooling rack for about 15 to 20 minutes. But don't they look beautiful? We can see the flaky layers. It sounds super flaky, and if we look at the cross section, we have a lovely honeycomb, really uniform, beautiful. So that's it for making croissants, but the croissant dough can be used for any pastry, and we'll look at these in further videos. But if you want to go really in depth with pastry making, then check out my online course. Here I go into way more detail about how to make the perfect pastries. The link is in the video description.